Welcome back to Chapter 3, Internal CSS, Part 4. Essential Outcomes. You will be able to use CSS internal style sheets to manipulate the physical design of a web page through the use of internal styling, by employing universal selectors, using the box model to style, and to create ID selectors for the div tag and the image tags, as well as apply key terms to application. Section 3-4, styling the footer section, the IDs for divs, and image tags. The footer. The footer selector is normally placed before the closing style tag up in the head section. If you look to the right, you're going to see that the declarations you'll need for the footer are as follows. You need the width and height, border, text alignment, padding, and any other styling you want to include in your footer. Before we discuss how to add styling to our div 1, 2, 3, 4 property values, we need to discuss floating. Floating is a way to trick CSS into moving block elements side by side. Dimensions. To float, it is very important that you have dimensions included in all of your block element selectors that you want to float or you want to have side by side. Why? Block elements such as div tags, headers, footers, and nav bars take up the entire space from left margin to right margin. CSS3 will not allow you to put two block elements side by side or alongside each other because there is not enough space. By adding the dimensions and the float property and value, you are tricking CSS into moving block elements side by side. Floating. You can either float an object left or right. You can also clear an object from floating as well. In Chapter 2, we created three or four div1 tags that are inside our ID container tag. It is now time to talk about how do we style these tags. All of the div ID tags are tags that are housed inside the container tag. Each of these div tags have different value names, different div 1, div 2, div 3, div 4. These ID property values need different names so that we can style them differently using the ID selector. Styling the ID div 1 property value. The ID selector for the div 1 tag follows the ID container selector up in the head section. In the example to the left, the ID div 1 selector name matches the ID value that's included in the div tag for div 1. Note, ID selectors always start with the number sign followed by the value's name. Styling the div 2. The ID selector for the div 2 tag follows the ID selector for the div 1. Notice that both the names match, and the div 2 selector has a number sign in front of it. In the example to the left, I floated the div 2 selector to the right because I wanted that section to be in the top right corner. Styling the div 3. The ID selector for the div 3 tag should follow the ID div 2 selector, Notice that the div 3 ID selector has the number sign and it matches the div 3 in the div third section. In the example to the left, I floated the div 3 selector back to the left because we wanted it to be on the left side right below the div 1 selector. Now note, you might have to do some adjustments with your min width, min height, and max height to get the div 3 to fit where you want it to fit. Also remember that my coding might not match the coding on your Notepad++. So you might have to, you're going to have to figure out how you want this to look. Remember, these are just examples. Styling the div 4. The ID selector for div 4 should follow the ID selector for div 3. If you look at the diagram to the left, my ID selector number div 4 matches the name, the value name inside the div tag. In this example, I wanted to move my div 4 section to the right of div 3, but below div 2. In that case, I have to float my div 4. Now again, here you're going to have to play with your max width, max height to make those adjustments so that it fits along, so that div 4 fits alongside div 3. Don't trust my coding or my sizes because your website is not my website. You're going to have to work with these and work with the pixel or the EM sizes in order to get them to float neatly and tightly underneath and alongside each other. Styling images. Images are considered by CSS3 to be inline elements. They're not block elements. What inline elements do is they only take up as much space as they need, whereas block elements went from left margin to right margin. Inline elements, however, are considered, their default setting is considered in line with text. What that means is that images cannot be placed on the same line as text. Rather, the image will be placed below text or below another image because it's set on in line with text. To change that, you're going to have to change the default setting for the images so that you can move them either to or wrap them to the right or left of text, or wrap an image to the right or left of another image. To do this, you will use the float element or your float property so that you can wrap that text or wrap the images around each other. Again, you can float an image to the left or to the right, or you can clear an image. Changes to coding the image. Before we actually talk about how we're going to add CSS3 styling to an image, we have to talk about the changes that you have to make now, since you are now using CSS3. The only attribute that will be included inside the image tag is the alt equals image. Alt, again, that's an alternative attribute, identifies the space in case the image does not appear on the web page. The remaining styling for an image is now going to be placed in the image selector that is inside the head tag, or between the head tags and between the styling tag. So now the image selector will go up into the style section. Styling an image. The following property and values are required for the image selector. You need the width, height. The following property values are optional for the image selector: adding a border radius, or margins. The border radius curves the corners of an object. It may be used on any object. It's kind of a neat feature. This is where you're tricking CSS to actually make a circle on an object or on a section. So this is kind of an interesting feature to use. Margins, you want to use margins with images when you need to add space between the image's border and the text. A lot of times you have to play with these property values in order to figure out how they function. So let's look at styling the image. As we said, we cannot have width or height inside the image tag that falls in the body tag. We can no longer use that. So the first thing we need to do is remove the height and width from the image tag, which is inside the body tag. Then you're going to style the tag in the head section and add the image selector with its declarations. As mandatory, you need the width and height. It's optional if you float, if you add a border radius, or margins. That's up to you. Those are optional. So the first step you'll need to do to add, to actually identify these images, is to add in the first image the ID equal image 1 into the image tag that is inside the body section. Then you're going to continue to add inside each of the image tags an ID selector for each of them. So if you look at the example, I have two images. Each of the images have been given a unique ID property value. I have image 1, image 2. The second step now is to actually create the unique ID selector for each image, and we will do that by going up into the head section, find the style, and between the opening and closing style tag, we will create our unique selector, the number sign image 1, number sign image 2. It's best if you can to keep all your images in order so that you know you have them all together, so it's a lot easier to move them and change them and adjust them. After I finished my coding for my images, then I ran the web page in Chrome, and you're looking at the two images on my website. There is an image 1 is in the top left corner, and if you look more to the bottom of the page, the second image is on the right side of the page. If you look at this, the styling, the reason why I created a special ID selector for each of these images is because I want to style them differently. The width and height of my first image is different than my second. I also floated this left, and I added a smaller border radius. If you look at the second image, it's coding. The image has its width and height is larger. It is floating to the right because I want this image to wrap around the text to the right, whereas in the image 1, I wrapped the image to the left of the text. Notice that I also have a different size border radius, and my margins are also different. So just a note, if you want an image to look more oval or circular, you would just increase the border radius size pixels. By increasing them, you will get it to look more oval. Removing borders. Once you have your web page set the way you want it to look, you can now remove the borders if you want to get rid of them. Just go back through and change the pixels for each border to 0 for those where you don't want a border. It is best not to delete the actual border coding in case you need to make adjustments later. Then you would have to rewrite the coding all over again. It's a lot easier just to keep it at 0. So looking at the final web page, in the top line I have my header. I have floated that nav bar to the right of my header. I have my div 1 tag to the left on the first line in my container tag. I have div 2 to the right, I have div 3 below div 1, and I have div 4 below div 2, and I floated the image around div 4, and then lastly I have my footer at the bottom of the page. I have left some borders on so you can kind of see the overall design, but you can remove borders. It just depends on how you want your website to look. But it's always a good idea to add borders so you understand the difference between your block elements and your inline, and that you can see what your block elements are doing when you're trying to figure out how to float and move sections. Some clarifications. You will learn how to officially set up a web page next chapter. This chapter, please focus on how to move objects around with your headers and your div tags. At this point, if you get this concept, inserting nav bars and social media icons and linking will be less complicated. Now that you have finished 3-4, it is time to go to complete your activities. Step 1, return to your index.html web page in Chapter 3. Create styling selectors for your container tags and all of your div tags. 3, see if you can get them side by side as in the examples given on slide 49. Here's a warning though. Be careful about copying codes from my web page. These codes are unique to my design and may not work well for yours. Also, you need to learn how to use these tags in order to create your own pages. So you need to start creating and experimenting sizes on your own. 5, make sure you have inserted at least 2 images. Create an ID selector for each of the images and style them differently. You have now finished section 3-4. When you finish the activities, please show me your work, then move on to the final section of this chapter, 3-5.